Okay, board members, we're gonna get restarted again here. And I did want to make a quick announcement. Our new board rep, Mr. Klingenberg, he has some tests tomorrow, so we excused him so that he could actually get home and make sure he was studied and well rested for that exam.
And he said it was a Spanish test.
All right, so we will move on to the next item on the list. So, board members, I need a motion for the approval of the FY20 contingent employee pay rates.
So moved.
Moved by Ms. Battaglia.
Second.
Second by Mr. Kyler. Dr. Lockard.
Okay, board members, at the June meeting each year, we bring for your approval the pay rates for contingent employees for the next fiscal year. These pay rates are for our substitutes and hourly employees. The pay rates presented are programmed into the adopted budget, and they include a plan to comply with the new minimum wage law in Maryland as it's phased in over the next several years.
Board members, any questions? Dr. Dorsey?
Yes, I was looking at the technical skills position and the range of the rate there, and
Yes.
and why there is a range, I guess, is what I'm questioning. Is it just based on experience, or?
Those jobs are, especially for our technology services department, it depends on the skill set that is required to facilitate those jobs. So it does require a range. It does allow us to hire people at different levels of experience.
Ms. Herbert?
Yeah.
Chantress, I do have one thing. Subs, what was the pay rate last year?
109.24.
Okay.
So we are increasing it by 3.5% to coincide with the parameters of.
All right. Thank you.
And that day 11 additional assignment that's on there,
Yes.
Does that happen often that we needed a separate scale for that?
Yes, it does. So that will, for a few years, we tried going to a consolidated substitute rate. We recognize that our administrators have difficulty with hiring or filling the sub jobs for long terms because those jobs have additional duties such as grading, meeting with parents. So this is to provide an additional compensation for those additional duties.
And the hope is, again, I'll speak from my principal experience, that I can find a great recently retired teacher out there who understands what comes with a long-term substitute job that would make that attractive for them to want to come back in that capacity.
Yeah, because basically it's the planning piece.
Yes.
For a regular classroom teacher, when they're out, they have to plan for their 10 days of absence, but then for the long-term sub, then the planning becomes their responsibility.
They're also responsible for parent-teacher conference nights, sometimes extra clubs that the teacher may have been facilitating, so they facilitate our bridging gaps of services in a multitude of ways.
Okay. Board members, any other questions? Okay, with that, I will call for the vote. All those in favor? It passes unanimously. Thank you. Okay, board members, I need a motion for the approval of FY20 unaffiliated employee pay scales.
So moved.
Moved by Ms. Battaglia.
Second.
Second by Mr. Kyler. Dr. Lockard.
Again, at the June meeting each year, board members, we bring your approval the unaffiliated employee pay scales for the next fiscal year. We have fewer than 200 employees who are not represented by a bargaining unit, and these unaffiliated scales in the packet are for those employees. Directed staff to present these scales with a 3.5% increase applied to the FY19 scale. This represents the average increase received through collective bargaining with other units except for CCEA, who, as you know, receives additional increases under Kerwin's state teacher salary grant. Employees on the unaffiliated scales will not receive a step increment in FY20, just the 3.5% increase.
And Dr. Lockard, you had said that there are less than 200 employees who fall into this category?
Correct.
Okay. And also, they won't be receiving a step. We're simply increasing the overall scale by 3.5%.
That is correct.
And we had discussed it. Does that cause any problems with placement of new hires?
I'll look to Ms. Baptist for that. I don't believe so. When we look at commensurate experience,
Correct. So the only difficulty is in regards to when looking at someone from outside of the county and commensurating experience, being as though for those periods which we did not provide steps, individuals outside of the county were still indeed receiving steps for some systems. So therefore, depending upon where they're coming from, they could be taking a decrease in pay.
So, board members, any other questions? No? All right. With that, I will call for the vote. All those in favor? Passes unanimously. Thank you. Board members, I need a motion for the approval of the revisions to Board Policy JICJ, Portable Electronic Devices.
So moved.
Moved by Ms. Battaglia.
Second.
Second by Mr. Kyler. Dr. Lockard.
okay, board members, we are bringing this back again after conversation over the last 2 months and implemented some changes based on the feedback we'd received. Mr. Johnson is here. In terms of changes from the original submission, Mr. Johnson, would you just briefly highlight that?
Right. So basically next year what we would see if this policy is approved and the regs with it, elementary students' cell phones are out of sight and stored from the time they enter the building until the time they leave the building. Middle school students, everything's stored away from the time they enter the building to the time they leave the building, with the exception of lunch at the discretion of the administrator. And high schools, they're out of sight, stored out of way, or out of hearing, and all those sounds are off in every time in the building except before school, after school, lunch, and class change. So those are the differentiated levels. We did get feedback about I had inadvertently struck a section about you can't videotape without permission, and that shouldn't have been struck. It was just an editing mistake in the first draft. So that's back in there. And so those are the changes.
Ms. Herbert.
Thank you for all the hard work, and I think we are going in the right direction, especially with all the feedback we got from parents and teachers, and you know, we had to do something because it was getting out of control. But I do have a question: if, like, the students, like in the high school, can still use their cell phones at lunch. I know it's been a lot in the news lately about how students are calling their lunches in through Uber or somewhere like that. Now, how, in all honesty, it was a big thing, and it's happening a lot in Baltimore. I think it was, I don't know what county, it was some Maryland county. But how do you address that?
We say no.
So when they come to the door,
Right.
see ya.
First
Okay,
of all,
I
can't,
don't.
right, you can't get into the building without being called in, and we would quickly find out who is ordering lunch out and deal with it. So we would not look kindly upon that.
Thank you for all the hard work.
Thank you.
Mr. Kyler.
And I know this has been a lot of hard work, and we've discussed it, seems like 100 times. I am still very skeptical about middle school students having the ability to use the phone in lunch. I almost think middle school ought to be the same as elementary. I'm not sure, and I mentioned last time, kind of in jest, that this is reviewed every 3 years, and the way technology changes, that's too long. How quickly can we maybe see how this is?
You can bring a policy at any time. We just have a routine cycle, but I will tell you, if the state makes a change, we address it right away. If we find something's not working, we address it right away. We have a list going into the summer of things that aren't up for review, but that have come up over this school year that we say we need to take a look at again. So just because we say it, we just want to keep it on some sort of schedule, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's every 3 years. It could be every 6 months, every 2 months, whatever. So
I think, like it or not, a lot of the parents want us to be the parents and say no for them. I don't know what the rest of the board thinks. The more I thought about it, and I heard, we had a wrestling party, so I talked to a lot of parents of a lot of middle school kids, and they were like, you know, and they wouldn't, they'd back down in a minute, but they're like, you shouldn't even let them have them on the bus. Well, I understand why to and from school and before and after school, but I'm very skeptical about lunch for middle school. High school, whether they order food or not, that's high school. By then, if we haven't taught them how to responsibly use them, we need to. But middle school, I'm skeptical.
Well, and that's not a change. You know, that's what we do now. So, I mean, that would not be a new change to the policy. That is just something that goes on now anyway.
And Mr. Kyler, I'll echo that. I think that's one of the concerns that I still have with the policy. I know that when we sent it out for the second round of comments, that was probably the most consistent thing that we saw in feedback, was the parents in the second round saying, okay, yeah, we think that, you know, we shouldn't have them at lunch in the middle schools, I think was the most consistent comment that we saw. And Mr. Streeter, I actually had a story relayed to me about what you had done as principal at Mount Airy Middle, where you had basically declared that you weren't going to allow cell phones at lunch for the middle schools, and I heard that you got a standing ovation from the parent population during orientation with that measure. So I know that we're trying to leave some flexibility for the principals, but do the principals want that flexibility, or would it be?
Mr. Hill,
I just want to address that, and absolutely that happened. The coincidental piece, that was when cell phones were just started at the elementary level. That was at a 5th grade orientation. So the parents were very concerned because the elementary level had just started, like I think Mount Airy may have been a pilot. But it was the decision that we made at the school to not do it, and that's what the policy is saying, that the administrator has the decision, the authority. There's times that, you know, if we get a week of rain, which has happened regularly, that the administrator might say it's appropriate that we can do this if students are maintaining some kind of order. At West Middle this year, when I started there, that's how things set up, that we had kids didn't have them, but then as the class or the group earned certain privileges, they were allowed to. And I think that flexibility is important, that we leave that with our school-based administrators.
Okay, so you think the principals do want that flexibility to either
Absolutely.
allow it or disallow it given a situation?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Hill, do you want to say something?
Well, I echo what Mr. Streeter said, which is that part of what we do with our policy is we give the principals the freedom to run their schools. A lot of principals do restrict lunchtime, and that's in here, that they have the discretion to do that. But there are times during the winter, during a lot of rain, that one of the things I don't want you to forget is that this policy is about kids who bring their phone correctly, carry it correctly, and also use it correctly. I don't want them to feel like they've lost their ability to do what their family wants them to do. We have a lot of latchkey kids. We have a lot of clubs after school and middle school. So it is different than elementary. There are times when especially families want to communicate. So I want the family to choose whether they want their child to have the phone there. I want the child to use it correctly. And what I don't want to do is when they come from 8th grade into 9th grade, have such a big transition that we never taught them what the proper things are or how to use it correctly. Because really, kids need to learn in a progression. Everybody here has a phone. They're eventually going to use it. It's a world of technology. We can't not use the opportunity to educate them on how to operate correctly. So that's why I like the progression in the policy. I like the freedom of the principals because they do an excellent job of knowing how to have our kids do the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I did have one other question about the elementary version of it. I know that we've added the statement, it is highly recommended that elementary students not bring their devices to school or on the school bus. I like the concept of that we're at least putting it out there, saying this is what we... I almost wonder, though, is there a stronger way to say it, like instead of highly recommended, because it's not really taking a stance, but if we say something like strongly advised, this is what we...
Whatever the board would want, and we would certainly direct principals at the elementary level to reinforce that at back-to-school night newsletters as well. So
Okay.
whatever the board chooses.
I don't know if board members, if you have any, I don't know if that adds any strength to it or not, but
And I agree with I'm glad it got added. Now,
Mhm.
whether we make it stronger or let the principals make it stronger, but I'm glad it was added. I think that was great.
right.
And I'm weak tonight. I think you guys sold me on middle school for now.
Learning curve.
As a former board member once said, it's only 3 years.
Oh, my God.
Okay, so board members, I'm not hearing necessarily any recommendations to change the wording.
Well, I think the message would be the same either way, right? And I think the parents of those students who would want them to take their device, I mean, they're still going to see that, okay, you're not highly recommending that my child have it, or you're strongly advising that he or she not have it, but as a parent, if I want them to have it, they'll have it. So I think the message basically is the same as far as I'm concerned.
Okay. So the one other message that I think that we heard from the feedback was that they're still concerned about buses. So, and I know that we have added this comment, which does help in that regard, but are we comfortable with the wording that is there for buses?
Yeah. I am.
If I could also interject, I think to the point that was made earlier, we don't have to wait 3 years. We'll certainly monitor if we have anything of significance that becomes, a pattern or a trend. We'll come back and bring that back and have further discussion. We can do that at any time.
Right.
Mr. Kyler?
So you promised to help us review this sometime next
Absolutely
year.
not. Absolutely not. I'll send feedback.
I do think this is a good step forward with the changes that have been recommended, and Mr. Johnson, I appreciate your
Well,
taking the lead on this.
It's all my colleagues, but it's certainly a definite reversal of course from where we currently are, and so I think, it will focus more on academics and not the distractions, and that's what we're all for. So, my recommendation is let's see how this goes, and if we need to change it, we can make some modifications.
Right. So it sounds like, Mr. Kyler, you would maybe be looking for getting some reports back on how do we think it's going once it's implemented?
Mrs. McCabe would be happy to do that.
I just want to say I'm very happy that we revisited this, and we heard the public loud and clear for several months, over to a year almost, their feelings, and I'm just glad we're able to get this accomplished. Thank you, sir.
All right. Board members, any other comments? Okay, then with that, I will call for the vote. All those in favor of the policy as submitted? Passes unanimously. Thank you. Okay, board members, I need a motion for the approval of revisions to the new equity policy.
So,
Moved by Dr. Dorsey.
Second.
Second by Ms. Battaglia. Dr. Lockard.
I turn to Mr. Anderson and Ms. Jones.
Board members, we've had the opportunity to have the policy set up for public review and comment. I'm pleased to report that over 90% of the feedback that we received was a positive endorsement of the policy. In addition to that, I was also personally responsible for presenting it to the Community Advisory Council as well to receive feedback. That too was extremely positive. In fact, there were some comments of, I was wondering why we didn't have this in place already. So that was very positive. Significant changes since the last time we met when we presented it to you is 1.3, achievement is raised for all Carroll County Public School students, and that action plans are developed and monitored to address persistent disparities. Another significant change from the first that was presented to you, the first iteration, was operational definition number 9. Fiscal equity means resources and/or funding are allocated with an intentional strategy, providing additional funding to schools and programs where inequities exist. And then the final piece,
And we can change that last word to exist.
instead of, yes, I got it, exists. And then the last piece is item 3.1, allocate resources to achieve fiscal equity and provide the necessary resources to identify and address the academic disparities among all student groups. So those were the significant changes that were requested. We've made those changes again. It's been sat out for the last month, and we are bringing it back tonight for your approval.
And thank you for adding the fiscal equity definition. That was very helpful to me to kind of understand exactly what that was referring to, so I appreciate that. And just to reiterate what you said, we all saw several responses from community feedback, and it was all overwhelmingly positive, so was very happy to see that. Board members, any comments or questions?
I think I hear Devin Rothschild jumping up and down.
No? And with that, I will thank you guys for all of your efforts. Clearly, this was a lot of work that went into this, and it's receiving overwhelmingly positive results, and we're very excited to take the vote. Board members, all those in favor? Passes unanimously. Thank you. Okay, board members, now I need a motion for the approval of revisions to Board Policy AC, non-discrimination policy.
So moved.
Moved by Ms. Battaglia,
Second.
second by Mr. Kyler. Dr. Lockard.
Okay, board members, at our May meeting, we proposed revisions to Policy AC, and that was there for board discussion. We also proposed revisions to our administrative regulations and Carroll County Public Schools guidelines for gender identity non-discrimination were presented for board information. You also had a legal analysis from Mr. O'Malley, and the board has received, in the meantime, several emails offering feedback on the proposed revisions. This was also brought to the CAC for input and feedback as well. Much like the equity policy, the feedback's been positive in support of the revisions, and much of the feedback is feedback requesting changes relates to the items contained in our guidelines, specifically for gender identity non-discrimination. So in light of that initial presentation, the discussion, the feedback, and recognizing the need to finalize all changes in advance of the final school year, I'm requesting that the board approve the proposed revisions to the policy AC, non-discrimination, and there is one proposed revision. It's right there on the front for you to see. With board approval of the policy, I will direct staff to continue to work to revise the administrative regulations and the guidelines to align with the policy and certainly consider the public feedback that we've been receiving around those guidelines. Board action now will allow us to update information for the public and to work with schools to implement revisions for next school year, and then I would update you with those regulations and guidelines.
So, Dr. Lockard, we don't have necessarily a timeline that you're looking to do those regulations or guidelines?
We would like to complete those over the summer so that we can hit the beginning of the school year in support of our schools and any updates and professional development necessary for our schools and leaders. So that work would happen this summer.
Okay. And then, so that would come back to the board, just to give us a heads up. I mean,
Yes.
that we don't have to approve those, but
No.
you would at least be...
I would provide you with the
Showing them.
updated guidelines and regulation.
Okay.
I have a question. In the statement, is there any way we can add a line or the words "or political affiliation"? Because we do have another election year coming up, and the previous presidential election year, there was a lot of discrimination regarding political affiliation. And I think something needs to be said regarding that too, because we did have a lot of, not a lot of problems in our high schools or middle schools, but there was some misunderstandings regarding stuff. So I think it's something we possibly might want to add.
Kind of looking to our legal counsel for any input on that.
The categories that are currently listed here are those that you typically see in laws like Title VII and Maryland's law on discrimination. I don't know that political affiliation is one that we typically see, and I'm a little hesitant to be adding it.
Would that be something that would
Yeah.
be covered in
Well-
either another policy? Go ahead.
It is.
Yeah.
So I was going to say,
Yeah.
at first, what Rochelle just said,
Yeah.
this policy's always been geared towards Title VII or the state version of Title VII, so those specific protected categories, and that's what you see on the screen. You also have a board policy, GBI, that addresses political activities of Carroll County
Yeah.
Public Schools employees, so you have that in a separate policy, and it's also addressed in collective bargaining agreements and human resources procedures. And in fact, every election cycle, Ms. Eisenberger, Mr. Milley generally tap me electronically on the shoulder, and through the directors, I send out kind of a reminder that we're in an election season, and here are the things that are appropriate and the things that you'd want to stay away from as an employee.
Board members, any other questions or comments? Okay, then I will call for the vote. All those in favor of the policy as submitted? It passes unanimously. Thank you.
Thank you, board members.
So, board members, now I need a motion for the approval of the 2019-2020 strategic plan.
So moved.
Moved by Ms. Battaglia,
Second.
second by Mr. Kyler. Dr. Lockard.
Thank you. Mr. Anderson's back for more.
Yeah. President Savigny, board members, Dr. Lockard, thank you so much for amending the agenda. I'm here to present the updates to the strategic plan as well as 7P, the approval of a proposed action to repeal policy AD, which is the core statement, values, and beliefs, and I'll be able to explain why in a moment. Wanted to give the board an update through the outstanding work of Greg Bricka, others in our technology service. We were able to update some of the metrics that from the work session. We've also included a document control page, which will, in the future, will provide specific modifications or record of modifications and revisions that have been made to the strategic plan. We have begun making our changes in regards to the About Carroll Public School facts, obviously the pillars in regards to the strategic plan. But one of the pieces that we are not able to make revisions to right now, and I misspoke when we were doing the work session, and I was informed by the executive leadership team, excuse me, that the core values, the core statements, values, and beliefs are actually policy, and that is why 7P was brought to you this evening as well. That policy, I believe, was originated in 1991, has been updated several times, with the most recent being, I think, 2012, where it sits today. The reason why I bring that up is because Dr. Dorsey, through our work session, made a number of suggestions in regards to the actual wordage and verbiage within some of our indicators, and we want to go ahead and make those changes. We were moving forward with that, but in order to do so, we would have to change the policy, the language of the policy, and then go back into the strategic plan where the actual core statements and values exist, if that makes sense to everyone. So what I'm suggesting to the board this evening is that we would take a vote on the updates to the strategic plan, the next iteration of the strategic plan, and then after that we can have a conversation in regards to the recommendation for the repeal of the other policy specific to the core beliefs, and then we can go ahead and have a conversation with what the board wants to do with that. That makes sense.
I think that does make sense, and
Okay.
I think I'd like to have a little bit of a discussion on the strategic plan.
Sure.
And I do really appreciate, I think the April work session was a really good work session to hash out the last of the items that we were really trying to work through, of setting measures in place that we were going to hold ourselves accountable to as a school system. And I really liked all of the recommendations that you made there, and I think we had consensus from all the board members during that work session that we were comfortable with the items that we had added. So I want to thank you for a very successful work session and getting that all incorporated in here.
Thank you.
And I do want to make sure that we keep with the concept of this is a living, breathing document, even though we're going to approve it tonight, or take a vote to approve it tonight. I do like the version control piece that was added. I think that's a critical piece. So as we go through it, it's, we can feel free to modify it at any given time, but we would just need to take a vote to change any of the items, and we could track it through the version control document. But I think it's critical that we do have a vote of endorsement of, at this point in time, these are our marching orders and what we're holding ourselves accountable to.
Yeah, and if I may, I know we've received public comment in regards to the disaggregation or the goal setting, if you will, and there are legitimate suggestions and responses. One of the things I want to remind the board is that this is our systemic plan. We are mandated by law through ESSA that, we are trying to eliminate the percentage of students that are not proficient by half by a certain period of time. And so I feel like we were extremely courageous in our attempts to write these goals, and ambitious, if you will, also when we set our standards to go after. What we also have to remind the public is that each school is responsible for writing their plan as well, and that's where we really begin to see those specific numbers really having more of a bite into showing the performance is going to change. And what we also know is that in order for this plan to be successful, each school must meet their goals. And so that's where we really begin to see that disaggregation take place.
Mr. Crowther?
Yeah, I'm curious, when did this start, and was that board's intention that ultimately it would be approved? And like you said earlier, and you just said about the individual schools, and you said earlier about it, to me it's very important this stays a living, breathing document and gets revisited as often as necessary. But when did this start, and was the intention to have it approved by a certain time, or is that a new concept?
So I'll start the conversation unless Dr. Lockard wants to go. You want me to start?
Well, I'll jump in.
Sure.
It started more than a year before I arrived last July. But even before that, more than
2016.
I think it started right as Ms. Herbert and I were coming into office.
Mr. Kyler, you asked a good question. I think all that time was taken to get stakeholder feedback and sort of coalesce around what's most important to the system moving forward. I don't know if the intention of a previous board was to put an approval on it or not. I know the intention was for plans to be created and reviewed. What we've tried to do is make sure that we have a structure where we don't just let it sit and address it once a year or come back to it 9 months later. We've built in sort of this annual schedule of different pillars that we're going to be talking about. And so I think that lends itself to sort of constant feedback and iteration. The same would be true for why we created priority goals. We have some big, broad objectives under each pillar. But we've also honed in on what does our data tell us right now that we need to focus on. That should be a priority. The other work continues for sure.
Yeah.
Mr. Anderson?
Yeah, in addition to that, I was just going to say, so the first stage was September 2016 through May 2017, and that really was, that year was gathering stakeholder feedback, and then moving into the second stage of community needs. Basically, there was facilitated focus groups with the key stakeholders and listening. and gathered community feedback and started planning for the pillars. And then the third stage, obviously, was implementation. I think Dr. Locker talked about that starting in February 2018. This is trying to became something a little bit more illustrative that we could look at and start to take look at and actually set a course on. I think that one of the other pieces that I'm just seeing in my short term here is that the actual measures that we're looking at also are going to be changing, and how the assessment is being completed as well. I'm not making excuses, but I am providing reasons for us to continue to remain malleable and look at the plan as something that is iterative. So we're going to continue to look at that. And that was part of the work session, was that we had set some, I'm not going to say arbitrary, but some goals we were in a place where we needed to set goals, but we didn't really have a lot of background on how to set that goal. And so as we're gathering information, we made more realistic goals, and something that is most importantly is attainable, because that kind of becomes the fuel of motivation for our students as well as our staff. So then we can go ahead and continue to modify those goals. And that's really what we want as a school leader. You want to continue to put your kids and teachers in a position to be successful. And we don't want the standard to be too low, but at the same time, I mean, everyone wants to be 100%. But the reality is that you have different cohorts coming in as well, and your population's changing as well. Again, not excuses, but reasons for us to go ahead and continue to remain revising.
And I agree with that. I mean, and attainable is the A in the SMART goal,
That's
right?
right, yeah.
So it's a key part of it. You want to have high, we want to set high expectations,
Sure.
but we want to make sure that they are actually attainable. And I think part of the problem, so the prior board, we looked at Vision 2018 in 2016 and said, oh, you know, it was set in 2013 as a 5-year plan, and when we got to Vision 2018, it was kind of a document that had been set off to the side and not really specifically addressed, and we hadn't met, I don't think, any of the goals that were in that document.
Nothing.
And so the prior board to this one basically came in and said, you know, any good organization has a strong strategic plan, and we need to develop that, and it needs to be something that we surround the culture of the organization. And I love, Dr. Lockard, the way that you've done that in the board agenda. We've aligned every one of our items to the strategic plan. I think we're just setting the stage to continue to run. We have a very successful organization, but I think our best days are still ahead of us.
We can get better. Yep.
We can be even better, and it's all about continuous improvement. So I appreciate all the work that's been done. And I do want to make one additional statement. So as we're prepping the budget for next year, I know that it was kind of a last-minute thing this year when we were talking about the additional positions and aligning them to the strategic plan. And I know that we had put some position statements together for those. For those 29 positions and trying to align them to the strategic plan. But what I would really like to do is use that as part of the budget process next year and basically say specifically, okay, we are looking to fill these positions, and these are the metrics in the strategic plan that we're looking to address with these positions and commit to those things.
Absolutely. We started that, obviously, we started that conversation when we had the joint meeting with the commissioners. And we specifically focused on Pillar 4, where we were providing the actual behavior data that we were collecting, and we were seeing the uptick with our youngest learners, that we're seeing more severe behaviors. The intensity of the behaviors are increasing. So we do know, and that was part of the justification for the request when we're looking at behavioral interventionists, psychologists, special education teachers as well. So that was all tied together when we did that presentation at the joint commissioners meeting, and Commissioner Weaver and I have spoken about it as well. That is an opportunity for us now to start looking at tying the positions to the actual strategic plan. So as we move forward.
I was going to say, I agreed, you know, just as they suggested, like a 5-year budget plan, rolling that into the strategic plan, we can start doing that probably soon. And that way they see where our future plans are to move ahead and improve the system even more.
Right.
Board members, any other comments or questions before we take a vote on the strategic plan? No? Okay. With that, I call for the vote. All those in favor? Passes unanimously. Thank you. And now we can move on to talking about the...
Yeah. So in policy AD, the core statement, values, and beliefs, the executive team was making a recommendation of bringing the policy for repeal to the board. Again, the reason being is that it sits in our strategic plan right now, and as we want to continue to make modifications and revisions to the strategic plan, we'd like to go ahead and have the availability to do so also with that language, and that's what we've run into. So if the board is willing, then the repeal to take place, then we could go ahead and continue to work at the strategic plan without bringing that section back in the future as policy. If not, then we would have to bring the policy with the suggested recommendations for your approval and change it, and then once we got that approval, then we could go back into the strategic plan and make the change. So it'll be a little while before we made the change of the language. So it's you know, up to the board how they want to go with that.
Board members, any thoughts on that? I guess I'll throw forth a couple of comments. And one of the things that I noticed as we were going through our voluminous board materials for this month, that the core beliefs and values, I think, are in most of the documents that we reviewed, and it's
Yes.
in the EFMP, it's
It's in our calendar.
it's in the calendar,
yes.
it's in ed specs, it's everywhere. And I think policy trumps strategic plan, right? So I feel pretty strongly that, okay, the core beliefs and values, I think they are just that. And I do think that they belong in policy. And while I recognize, Dr. Dorsey, I totally agree with the changes that you wanted to make to the wording in the strategic plan, or to the core beliefs and values, but I think it probably makes sense to, I'd be more comfortable with keeping the policy in place and going back and revisiting the wording of the policy and approving that, and then pushing those changes through all the other documents that are based on it. Just because I think policy trumps the strategic plan, and I think that core values and beliefs are pretty, and they're pretty core to the system. So I don't know how other board members feel about that. Mr. Kyler?
Yeah, I guess, what's the downside either way? If we repeal this tonight, then technically we have none until it gets revised. If we keep it and revise it, which one's easier and which one's harder? I'm not sure I understand. You know?
It's neither. I mean, the work is not a problem to do. It's more, I think, of a sense that it is now, I think the comment was made, you know, we want this to be a working, living document. This is not something that's going to sit on the shelf. This is not going to sit in a file. This is going to be something we're always working on. So that's the argument about keeping it as part of the strategic plan and not necessarily a policy that, and it has been revised probably 6, 7, 8 times since 1991. But I think that's the biggest piece is that we've had it. It has remained a policy in our system for quite a long time, and
I think.
Oh, I'm sorry.
What do other people that you've been working with this action here, do they feel the same thing? I mean,
the people that
Yeah,
we're
that you're
working on the
working with.
document with, yeah, and even executive leadership team, it was a recommendation that I bring it
That's-
to you all as a potential repeal because it's now a working document of ours that we're looking at
and they
daily.
feel that this would be the best way to go.
I think it was definitely a proposal that we wanted to bring to you because we
Right.
feel like it's not going to be, to your point, President Savigny, it's not going to be lost. It's going to be something that I think one could argue brings even more value as it sits here and we're always looking at it and working with it than it's sitting in as a policy that's been around for a significant amount of time. It has evolved, it has changed, it has been revised. But, now, if anything, I think it's more prominent as something to guide us. To your point, their presence of any policy trumps a strategic plan, right? So I think that's the other side of the argument. So we could go either way with it.
I think just core values and beliefs are just that, right? So I don't know that they necessarily want to be changed a lot.
Sure. Okay.
But at the same time, you don't want them to get stale, right? Because everything that we deal with in the educational system changes pretty regularly. So.
Yeah. So in this particular situation, responding back to Mr. Kyler's comment, nothing's going to be easier or harder. It's just what's at the pleasure of the board.
So if we remain as is, in July, we'd come with a policy
Update.
change to your recommendation, Dr. Dorsey, for including language that you had suggested previously to be included in the core statement, values, and beliefs.
And once we got that approval, then we would just go ahead and change it within the strategic plan. And one of the things that we would the board would need to be aware of is that lots of things would be going to printing beforehand. So we might be a year out in regards to the actual language that's in the policy as well as in the strategic plan may be a little bit different than what folks may see in publication that's been pushed out already for next year.
Okay.
Your calendar, your other things.
Okay, so
And those pieces, again, it's not an extensive amount of changes, but there is the piece there, and taking off the reflecting was the first thing in the core values that Dr. Dorsey had presented. The other one was emphasis on diversity as one of our core values, respecting and appreciating diversity. I think that makes perfect sense. And then the third piece, obviously, is facilitate the learning by encouraging, prompting, and interacting, and connecting in regards to relationships was a recommendation. So we have the recommendations. We're ready to move on them. So.
Okay, so board members, do we have consensus for which direction we'd like to take? Would we like to modify the policy, or would we like to repeal the policy? Mr. Kyler?
And I don't have an answer. I have a question, but I think we want to do, I'm looking at the policy, and like you said, 1991, revised in 2012, and other than that, it's set someplace in a book. That's what we definitely don't want.
Right.
So what is the best way moving forward? Like you say, policy trumps the other. So do we want to update that and make sure we consistently update it, or do we want the living, breathing document, and this has been a waste of 3 pages for the last 5 years?
So, Mr. Anderson, do other school systems in Maryland, do they typically have a core values and beliefs in
Absolutely.
policy?
I would have to go back and look, but I could look maybe some of my experts. We would have to go research and see. But I can tell you this right now, that each school system, yes, does have the core values, beliefs, and core statements and values and beliefs, yes. So at this point, again, it's kind of like we just wanted to see where the board was at with it. It's not going to be sat anywhere because we know it's in our strategic plan, right? It may be that it's something the board wants to maintain as policy.
I see it a couple ways. If the board is raising their hands and approving a strategic plan, then everything that's in it is approved by the board. I'm not suggesting that it's policy, but it's board approved. So everything in here is board approved. Our core statement, values, and beliefs is. If it weren't in the policy, it's still board approved because you all just approved the strategic plan.
Right.
Other systems, right? Other systems, I know that their boards endorse or approve core statements, values, and beliefs. I'm not exactly sure if in every other system it's a policy by itself.
Right, that's what I would look
or a
at.
statement reflective of the approval of the consensus of the board. Being nimble is a good thing in that, like you just mentioned, Mr. Kyler, I think there was 2 updates to this in a couple of years.
That was
Yes.
Yep.
We're going to be looking at our strategic plan every other month. Well, I
Every
think
month.
maybe every month, the way we have it laid out. To your point, I don't know that we need to change our core statement values and beliefs every month or every other month, but I think we need to do it more frequently than every 21 years.
Right. And Ms. Eisenberg, I saw that you were nodding your head over there, so it's not required to be in policy.
It does not have to be in policy, no.
Okay, and the fact that we are approving, taking a vote to approve the strategic plan, we are by default approving the core
Absolutely.
values.
And so that's why when I went ahead and said I misspoke, because I was unaware of that being a new person here, that it was a policy, and executive team informed me of that, so.
Okay.
And I think
So it already tied your hands once.
yearly we can take a look at it and see if we want to add something or take something away before it has to go out to print for the following school year. I think that's something we can definitely do.
Right. Okay. Board members, any other questions or comments?
I guess I'm questioning where we're landing here. I know it's what we're discussing at this point, so I just want to make sure that I'm clear. So if we make the changes on these beliefs and values, and it's a part of the strategic plan, that at least it's documented here, and since this is our living, breathing document, it could be, again, indicated here, and that's what we would, continue to move forward with. So if we do that, I mean, is there any need to do anything to a policy, or?
So right now, in order for me to change that language that you've recommended, if we did nothing right now, then I would have to go into the policy and change it and bring that back for approval. If you repeal the policy, then it's a working document, and we can work through it and bring it back to you each month, and we can,
And you would have a version control, right? It
Version
would be, so we're on 3.1 right now, this should be 3.2,
correct.
or some
Yes.
variation thereof.
So that seems to make sense, right?
So I think I'm comfortable that we appeal this and go with our living, breathing document and with board approval.
Right. Ms. Herbert?
I agree, because that's why I asked Mr. Anderson to begin with. What did your group of diligent workers, you came up with this, there was a reason, and I'm very interested
This was
in
also-
repealing this.
Yeah, this is also, we talked a little bit about this also at Cabinet, and you had multiple leaders from different parts of the organization that was basically endorsing this idea of potential repeal.
And that's why I feel if you guys have been working on this, and these are coming up with your ideas, I really thank and really respect everybody's ideas. So I think I've got to go with you.
And I agree with that. I came in tonight thinking, no, I don't want to repeal this. I would much rather leave it in policy, change the policy, and then push it through. But I appreciate all this discussion. I think that now, after we've talked through it, I'm comfortable with that. So let me just make sure that I'm summarizing it properly for the vote, is that we are taking a vote on repealing. Sorry, let me make sure I say this
Policy
properly.
AD, yeah.
That we're going to repeal Policy AD, Core Statement, Values and Beliefs. That is what we'll be taking the vote on. And then how we will follow up with version control on changes to the strategic plan. So that is now the motion on the table. Do I have a second?
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Kyler. Any other comments or discussion? And I will call for the vote. All those in favor? It passes unanimously. Thank you.
Then I'll begin doing the work on the changing of the language as well then. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Anderson.
When the attorney smiles, you know we're doing okay.
Okay, board members, I need a motion for the approval of the educational specifications for Carroll County Career and Technology Center addition renovation. Did I miss one? I did miss one. I apologize. I apologize. Board members, item 7M, I need a motion for the approval of the Educational Facilities Master Plan 2019-2028.
So moved.
Moved by Ms. Battaglia. Second by Dr. Dorsey. Thank you. Dr. Lockard.
Okay, board members, now onto the lighter portion of the agenda. As we discussed at the May work session, for this purpose and in the joint meeting with the commissioners, the Educational Facilities Master Plan, or EFMP, is presented to you for approval in June each year so that it may be submitted timely to the state by July 1st. At the work session, staff and I highlighted some areas that were where changes were being made from the prior year. And I made two specific recommendations at that work session. The first was to form a committee to explore redistricting options to alleviate the overcrowding at Freedom Elementary. The committee would follow Board Policy JCAA guidelines and report its conclusions in August of 2020. Secondly, I recommended that we monitor the enrollment at the middle schools in the southern region of the county for another year. Also at the work session, you received the East Middle feasibility study from our architect, Mr. Hagan. Following the work session, the board has received emails on the EFNP and in particular on East Middle. We also held a public hearing the week after the work session, and you've heard from several speakers at that public hearing as well as at our board meetings. Okay. In order to begin to move a project for East Middle forward starting next year and not delay it for another year, your adoption of the Educational Facilities Master Plan tonight would require that you act to include something more specific than the undefined project in the current plan. You don't necessarily need to select a specific option from the feasibility study, but at a minimum, need to define the project, whether modernization, replacement, etc. Lastly, at the work session and in the past, we've heard from Mr. Zaleski and Ms. Effingham from the county that there is available dedicated capital funding to fund the project between $30 to $40 million available for the local cost share while continuing to cover our existing CIP.
Dr. Lockard, can you help me understand why it needs to be more specific? Because when we go through and do the CIP development for October, we would clearly be picking a more specific way forward as we're developing that capital improvement plan request.
Mr. Kane, you want to talk about that timeline?
So the facility master plan is your 10-year facility plan. The capital improvement plan is the 6-year implementation for the 10-year plan. So to request, and it's a state requirement when we send a CIP request that it is linked to the facilities master plan. So if you leave the undetermined and you decide at the capital plan to insert a project, then you would have to come back and amend your facility master plan. You certainly, the board could leave it as is, but if they wanted to insert something in the capital plan, then at that point they would have to amend the facility master plan so that it did match your capital plan.
And how difficult is that to do, to amend the EFMP if what we're doing is saying, because right now it just says undetermined project for East Middle and William Winchester Elementary.
Right. So during the development, once the plan is approved by the board, then I start working on the capital CIP request and developing budgets for the projects that are in the first 6 years of the facility master plan. For that project, I wouldn't start working on any kind of CIP because it's still undetermined. I guess during the discussion, either in September or October, of what the CIP request that's presented, if the board wanted to insert something, then I'd have to go develop the budgets at that time. But amending the facility master plan, it's just, changing the language, bringing it back to the board and having the board approve it. There's more work on the capital side because I have to develop the budgets associated with the project and get it into the CIP that's presented to the board.
Mr. Kyler?
Do we have the exact wording of what it says now available tonight?
It's in the actual facility master plan document on page page 6-13. It says undetermined capital project for East Middle and William Winchester Elementary. It's included in the educational facility master plan calendar, or the 10-year look.
And we were able to move forward with the feasibility study given that language, but now that the feasibility study is done, we wouldn't be able to do a capital improvement plan request on that wording, correct?
So for the coming year, the next step would be to request local dollars to hire an architect to begin design. So we could certainly include, the difficult thing is, when we're presenting it to the county and we're asking for design, what are we asking design for? It's very difficult to budget, to create a budget estimate if you don't know what the scope of what you're asking for is. So it would be, we could certainly put a number in, but it would be a total guess. And then the county, typically we put in the planning request in the budget year, but then we also show them in the out year what the total project would cost. It's going to be difficult to do that in this case. So really, not knowing that makes it much more difficult, and much more likely that the amount of money that we request may not be accurate. So the sooner that we know, the sooner we get it in the process, in the request to the county. And we certainly couldn't go out on the street to hire an architect without knowing what the scope of the project is, because the architect would say, well, how am I going to price the job if I don't know exactly what you're doing?
Ms. Herbert?
My problem is that we've gotten information, but as a board, we have not discussed East Middle, even, we have not, as a board, talked about any of the 5 options, A, B, C, D, or E. We have not sat down and done that, and I want to do it right. And and yes, we have had a lot of people come and talk, and then we've also had emails. But as a board, we have not talked about it. But can we? You just can't put in there new school, or it has to be more specific than that.
Well, typically we would put in, and what was in the plan prior to the discussion of a K-8 was just an East Middle modernization. And if that was in here, that would be enough to know, okay, the scope of it is it's just a middle school replacement or renovation, and we could certainly put that in the CIP. The confusion has been, is it a K-8, is it a, that's the back and forth. So.
Yeah, because I don't, here's another new project, and I'm not sure of the correct lingo or what we would, how do you do that? And we need guidance.
I think, Ms. Herbert, another thing that Bill was sort of saying, just to be real clear, what you don't have to do tonight is pick option A, B, C, D, however many there were, or E.
Yeah.
But if you're at a place as a board, and I know you only had the one work session to have the discussion, but if you are at a place as a board where you say, well, we know we want to do a renovation, or we know we want to do these are just hypotheticals. We know we want to do a replacement middle school, but we're not sure if we want to do that replacement at Site A or Site B. But if you're comfortable saying something like that, then everything that would start happening staff-wise, not engaging architects and that sort of thing, we could do an awful lot of work between now and the CIP request in October to sort of flesh that out and give you even more information beyond the feasibility study to discuss that. So it doesn't have to be A, B, C, D, or E, or B, B versus D, it could be modernization through replacement or modernization. That would let them get off and running so that when it's time to do the CIP, you can have a fuller conversation about what that looks like and what that means. And of course, if you're not comfortable at all, then you're not comfortable at all, and we'll
Well,
deal with that.
look, we've waited a long time, and something has to be done, and better sooner than later, but I don't want to rush it. But if you could just put a replacement, I could deal with something like that, but not a renovation for me personally. I don't know how all my other 4 board members feel, but we got to get going, and it's going to take a long time anyway. So I wasn't sure of the correct wording. Thank you.
Mr. Tyler?
I think I'm still looking at an old one. What are the notes say? I can't read that. What's the note? Are they significant?
The note under the title, or the note, off to the right, I got you. It says,
Yeah.
the note there says a feasibility study exploring the options for East Middle and the K-8 facility is being presented to the Board of Education in May.
So that could be struck. What if you just struck the word undetermined and let it say capital project for East Middle and William Winchester?
Well, then, the difficult thing, and the reason that it says undetermined is really the choice that we're requesting is it a K-8 school which addresses both East Middle and William Winchester, or is it just an East Middle project? If the board was able to make that decision and say, we're just doing an East Middle project, put it in the facility master plan, that's really enough direction to kick into the next phase of, okay, now we know what we're doing, we'll start the project process and start asking for funds to design it and go through the process.
Right, and that's where I think I'm struggling, because if it, like, I don't think any of us are in favor of trying to do a renovation of East Middle where it stands, but I don't think that we've had any discussions or have any consensus on what is the right way forward, whether it's just middle school, whether it's a K-8, what site it's on. So I think that's where we don't know yet. We haven't had the discussions as a board to get there.
And I can agree to that because, like, there's questions I have regarding William Winchester that I haven't got answers on. And, you know, still kind of waiting for that. I mean, yeah, I have my opinion on what I could vote now to do, but there's still questions I have.
Commissioner Weaver?
Just, you know, as you're deciding what you do, I think you have up to $40 million left in the dedicated income tax here for capital improvements of schools. But the more that's being used, the more debt service we have on that money, which gives us less funds for other things in the school system. And with the tech center taking $30 million, you take another, you know, how much you use here, it may limit the next project that you decide to go to. So you got to look down the line, even beyond this one, as far as how much funding will be available for these. And you do need to keep up with 40 buildings on a regular basis, but I just caution, you know, the availability money after this, or how much you're going to use in this, where we go.
But I think that's how we got in this situation, is because previous boards were constantly like, well, we're told there's no money to do this, we're told there's no money to do that, and we end up closing 3 schools in the process. One that never got repairs done to it. And I don't want to see that happening anymore. We've got to do something. There can no longer be this, well, let's wait and see. It has to be, we have got to take care of our buildings. And that one speaker made, I mean, he exactly said it. Yeah, it might just be a building, but that is also part of the child's education and the staff. So we have got to start making sure our buildings are taken care of.
Dr. Dorsey?
My only comment at this point is that I would like to see an East Middle replacement.
Yep.
Mr. Fowler?
What if, I think I know where I stand, but I'm one of 5. I don't think the 5 of us know for sure that we want a middle school or a K through 8. What if this just said replace, get rid of renovation, replaced East Middle with a middle school or a K through 8. Is that still not a...
You certainly could do that in the facility master plan, but that wouldn't provide any guidance for developing a CIP budget, because to develop a budget, you have to know the size of your building.
Oh, but when's that happen?
I start working on the CIP request in July to bring to you in September, so I start developing the budgets. And it comes to the board in September, there's a public hearing, and the board approves it in October.
So, board members, could I make a suggestion? I'm listening to the comments, and it doesn't sound like any of us are in a place where we know what the project is that we would want to move forward with. I mean, we've been given information, but we haven't been given all of the information that we feel that we need to make that decision, and we need to have significant discussion amongst the 5 of us and staff. I don't think that we're at a point where we can feel comfortable with what we would choose as the words to put in the EFMP, but that doesn't lock us in. I mean, what Mr. Kane said was that if and when we do decide what the project needs to be, we can go back and pretty easily amend the EFMP. I would just recommend that we continue to have these discussions, and when we know what project that we want to pick, that's when we would go back and amend the EFMP.
Could we possibly narrow down the options tonight? Like, could we possibly say, okay, us as a board, and this is just me saying, we don't like A, D, or E. So let's just say the board is looking at B and C, but we need more info. Like, that's why I'm just saying, like, is there something we possibly can narrow it down? That way they can have some type of idea on funding or...
So when you say B or D, or are you... I don't have them in front.
B is just the rebuild the middle school, and C is the middle and elementary at the east site.
So
Like, forget Friendship Valley site, forget just...
So right. So the bigger issue from a timing perspective, you know, John just brought it up, is although the budget is, it is tied to the budget. The other thing is, if there is a desire to start planning and hire an architect and start planning next summer, next July 1, fiscal year 21, before you hire an architect, you also have to form a planning committee and develop the ed spec for the project. And you can't do that until you know what the scope of the project is. And that generally takes 6 months for a planning committee to develop. Sometimes for a K-8 it may take longer because it's not something we've done. The career and tech ed spec process certainly took longer because that was unusual. So the further the decision is pushed, potentially the further we can begin to start designing it, and then that pushes construction. So it's not to say that the board certainly needs to feel comfortable, but there is a timing implication to waiting, longer to make the decision.
So is the concern getting going with a budget, or is the concern this document? I'm lost now again. If it's this document, we can just say replace East Middle.
So the concern is if there's a desire to start planning it next summer so that construction can begin the following year. The budget request is for planning to hire an architect, but before we can do that, we also have to do an ed spec planning committee, and that generally takes 6 months at least to develop that, which means if the board doesn't decide until October, November, then they form the planning committee in November. The ed spec isn't done at the time you're issuing to issue an RFP to hire an architect takes several months. You're not issuing the RFP until the ed spec's done. Mm-hmm. Now you're not hiring the architect until later into the year. So it's just a timing perspective, really. There's a concern, and it's just, I guess from staff perspective, it's really the board's desire. It's not, we're just trying to share information. I know there's been concern about doing it as quickly as possible, but ultimately that's the board's decision. When they're ready to do the project, when they're ready to ask for funding from the commissioners and the state.
Ms. Battaglia?
Can I suggest that we have a work session to ask the questions we want, to hopefully get the answers we want, such as possibly how much are the renovations would cost for William Winchester, having the price comparisons, having the savings, and all the analysis to go in a row, because I think that's where I'm even struggling too, because I haven't seen any of that. You know, when, like, I was a huge advocate for the K through 8, like the risk committee had suggested. That actual same building was not as an option. So there wasn't even a way to even possibly look to see, like, this is how it could work. And I think that's where a lot of us are stuck, is like there's things that we have not seen.
So
I'm not opposed to having a work session. And in fact, I think that's probably the right next step. I would be much more comfortable with us convening for a work session in the near future to discuss these things. And I think that we have to include the commissioners in those discussions as well, because it does no good for us to spend a lot of time putting forth a project that we know we're not going to have any support from them to begin with. So I think rushing this isn't the answer. I think that we need to have a work session and hold hands and have it at both sides of that equation answer questions.
I think you have support. It's just, you know, it's amount of money that's going to be taken, and then what else do you need in the future too? So I'm not sure it's, you know, there's a lot of factors come in to decide what you're going to do here, and it's all financial. I hate to say it, but that's what it amounts to. So the fact is, you know, you do have to modernize and keep up all your buildings. That's understood. And you do 40 buildings. If you do just one a year, it's going to take 40 years to get there. So you're going to have to go through it. It's just
I'll be dead and buried.
but you know, it's how much you're going to use in this building and what's your next project then. So it's a concern.
Okay. So board members, what I'm hearing is that we don't have consensus on the right way forward tonight, but we do need a work session in the near future in order to have those discussions. So is that?
Yeah, I think what you're saying, to move forward, you need to know, no, I don't think anybody thinks East Middle should stay standing. But the question is, I think some of us maybe want a K through 8, some of us want a middle school. And unless we know which, if we just said tonight, build a middle school, you're happy. If we said build a K through 8, you're happy. But as long as we're saying we don't know which one, it's no sense even changing this document, right?
Right. I guess, you know, a couple of thoughts. You know, I think what Commissioner Weaver may be saying is, we've heard from Ted and Deb, you have enough money to do one or the other schools. You don't have enough dedicated local income tax to do both now. Secondly, it would be extremely helpful if through the superintendent you could get to us whatever other information it is you need that you didn't get in the work session, so that we could prepare that and have it for you. I'd say that there's, you know, I know it was only one example that Board Member Battaglia said, but depending on your expectations, you might be disappointed because we don't have a feasibility study for William Winchester. For better or worse, that wasn't a board action and a process that happened, so the best we could, it would not be an apples to apples comparison. The best we could do is just take some square footage industry cost estimates and say we believe it would be this much to replace this system on Willie or this other system on William Winchester, but it would not be comparing the feasibility study you have that has the systems for East to something that's the same for William Winchester. So I just wanted to, you know, put out there in advance that depending on your expectations, we may not be able to meet those directly for examples like that. And then I've seen Ray and Bill and Jim and others do miraculous things, and I have all the confidence in the world in them. But to me, Bill's being a little bit modest. I'm concerned that it would push it one more year. You know, he's saying we might still get there after October. And that may turn out to be true, but I also don't think we should be, that it shouldn't be shocking if this pushes it another year, meaning planning would be an additional year out, construction a year beyond that.
And I think it's what disappointed me regarding the feasibility study. Like I said, I'm grateful that we have it, and it was kind of like a hallelujah moment. Okay, fine, we finally, like, this is what has been said forever. But there was really nothing showing regarding William Winchester. There was like no comparisons regarding it. Like, we're going to do this K through 8, but it's going to be a middle school and an elementary school on the same site. But there was nothing regarding William Winchester. Like, this is the savings regarding this. This is how many kids walk.
Sure.
Because we've heard how many kids walk to East Middle School. We haven't heard how many kids walk to William Winchester.
And that kind of information we could certainly bring to a work session. And I guess all I can say, Ms. Battaglia, is for better or worse, that was the board decision back in November, I guess, Dr. Lockard, based on the risk report's recommendation. In hindsight, you know, perhaps the scope should have been more to include, I guess what you're asking for is what would it cost to replace the systems of William Winchester. But that wasn't what they produced what we hired them to produce. They didn't fail to produce something. That was the board decision in November as part of Dr. Lockard's series of risk recommendations, and Horkipple and Mock produced what was requested of them. So all I'm saying is we can't produce the same exact comparison ourselves by, you know, for a work session, but we could give you square footage estimates for systems. It's just not at all the same thing. It's
Right.
not even remotely an apples to apples comparison.
I know he's given a couple estimates before, like this is how much HVAC would be, or the roof, or the windows, or this, you know, this system. And then I know that's been done several times, and I think that helps too to understand. You know, they have portables. How much would it cost to build an addition versus, you know, right? See, I mean, that's the comparisons. Long-term cost savings.
Board members, we'll take a couple more questions, and then we're going to have to call it. Okay, Mr. Kyler.
I'd hate to see this backed up a year. East Middle should have been done 5 years ago. What if we had a work session in July and made a decision at the August meeting on whether it's a middle school or K through 8? Does that meet the time frame, and is that feasible to do that? Which means we'd have to get questions to you in the next week or two. But I think this is important enough. I think we need to do it. I risk, and smack me if you disagree, I don't think we need to do a joint meeting with the commissioners. I think we need to know about how much money they have, and we decide what kind of school we want. And I think we can make that decision and move forward. I think we can, and I think we have to. And I think the money constraint is one of the factors.
So we still have to submit this by July 1. I assume if that, what you just described happened, we'd submit as is, and then we'd have to do a revision subsequent to July 1 and send that revision back to the state.
Which is reasonable to do, correct? We can't sit here tonight and say middle school or
We've
K.
certainly done it in the past, so yeah.
Good.
So, board members, are we comfortable with that we will move forward with a work session? We won't change the wording in the EFMP tonight, but we will move forward with the process, and if an amendment needs to be made to the EFMP after submitted, then we'll handle it that way.
Again, I'm comfortable with an East Middle replacement.
Okay.
So, gentlemen, we'll try to schedule a July work session. And we'll try to get as much of the board's questions to staff so that we can have answers. Don't forget the information we got from the feasibility study, which examined costs of, estimated costs of different options. That absolutely needs to be a factor, particularly as Mr. Weaver has stated. While $30 to $40 million of local capital funds are there, that will also dictate then how much remains for future projects, and so that would certainly be a consideration of the board. But, Mr. Kyler, I'm sorry.
Ask one more thing, Pat. Dr. Dorsey made me think. I still don't quite understand. This document, if it said, replace East Middle School, and that's all it said, then do you have to change it depending on which we're building? I understand for your budget and moving forward constraints, but if we just say what Dr. Dorsey just said, is that enough to put in this document and keep you from changing it? And then I think we should do that. We know we want to replace East Middle. That's no question. And then if something else happens, then you have to change it. But if that saves you from having to change it, why not do that?
It would, I guess, that would be fine for moving forward. I guess the only, if during the work session there was some other alternative, then we would have to change it, but we'd have to change it anyway.
That's right. So odds, this
right.
might work. Do you guys agree?
I mean, I was wondering about the K-8, though, the fact that if we decide that we wanted to move forward with the K, because I know that there are some
Oh, yeah.
members of the board that they're not willing to say it's just East.
But we're not saying what we're replacing it with. So for this document, not for planning, but for this document, does that cover it?
I would think that would be sufficient. If you were to add a K-8, then you would have to, amend it anyway. And if it was going to be William Winchester or whatever elementary you were going to combine with, you'd have to insert that in then as well.
I mean, if we have to amend it anyway, I'm not sure why we would change the wording that's in there at the moment.
You're right. You're right. If that doesn't cover it, yeah.
Okay, so I would like to make a motion that we submit the EFMP as is, and that we have a work session over the summer to address the options and the way forward for an East Middle project and what all that might entail. Do I have a second?
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Kyler. I guess board members, were there any other questions for the EFMP or revisions that you would like to see made?
If we at least have something on there, it's not pushing it back even further. But I also don't want to give the community false hope. That's another issue that can always come up.
Right.
Board members, right now you have a motion with a second. So either you vote on that motion or you put in an amendment to it. But right now you have a motion to vote on.
Okay, and the motion that we stated was that we submit the EFMP as written currently, and that we have a work session over the summer to discuss options for East Middle. We had the second, and so now I will call for the vote. All those in favor? All those opposed? Okay, it passes by a vote of 4-1 with Ms. Battaglia dissenting.
So can you describe what's going to happen at the meeting that we have over the summer?
Okay, so we will need to schedule a work session, and we will need to develop all of our questions. So we need to have commitment from board members that we will submit the questions that we have, the types of information that we are looking for. Let's make sure that we submit those. Today's date is June 12th. I'm going to say within 2 weeks, June 26th, that we will submit the request for the information, that we would submit those to Dr. Lockard.
And the outcome of that meeting
Does that work for you?
would be what? Just that we would get all of our questions answered, or is the outcome going to be to select an option to move forward with?
I think we have to have those discussions at the work session. I mean, depending on how the questions are answered, and if we can come to consensus on what the right way forward is, then we would make a decision at that meeting. But I think we'd have to see how that meeting goes, whether we're comfortable taking a vote at that meeting of the way forward.
And I think staff has presented what some of the timelines are, and if we're not able to make a decision, what happens to those timelines? They get moved back another year?
Right.
Right.
I have one procedural question, if I may. Would you like us to have the architect at this meeting again, or just a staff-to-board conversation?
I think that would be helpful.
Can we make that decision once we see what the questions are that we have? If we know what the questions are, then we can determine whether the architect would be helpful or not.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right, thank you, board members. Okay, moving on. I need a motion for the approval of the educational specifications for Carroll County Career and Technology Center addition renovation.
So moved.
Moved by Ms. Battaglia,
Second.
second by Mr. Kyler. Dr. Lockard.
Okay, board members, you've been monitoring the project for the Career and Technology Center renovation throughout this year. Mr. Kyler and Ms. Battaglia are serving on the planning committee. We appreciate your help there. At the May work session, you received an updated presentation from our architect, Mr. Hagan, on the progress of the project and the schematic design based on the educational specifications and the approved county budget. We noted during that presentation that in order to maintain the overall schedule for the project and to bring the state fully into the project next year, we'd need to bring you for approval in June this month, both the educational specifications and the schematic design, both required for submission to the state. So, members, back to you.
Board members, questions? Ms. Battaglia?
The one thing I remembered Mr. Lord had brought up was the print department on the second floor. And visiting there, I mean, you see the big boards and everything, and I will admit that does kind of concern me, that heavy equipment on a second floor building. Is there any way to switch it around?
Yeah, so we've been working extensively with the staff and the architects through 3 iterations of looking at the layouts, and the print production teacher, the principal, Mr. Eccles, the architects all feel that it's perfectly fine for the print production program to be on the second floor. The pieces of equipment they have can come in components, and they can be moved in using the elevator. The deliveries of what they're receiving can be used or delivered through the elevator. There were no concerns, and certainly the structural engineer is going to make sure that whatever's on the second floor can be supported. So, we certainly heard the concerns back at the November work session, but and ideally, I would say yes. We would probably, in a perfect world, have it. But there's a lot of programs that want to be on the first floor, on the ground floor in the career and tech, and it was, I guess, less critical that print production be than some of the ones like carpentry, masonry, the ones that get culinary, cosmetology, who has, the public coming in. So in the end, kind of that was a joint or collaborative decision, working with the staff at the Career and Tech Center and the architects and everyone. So
does the print department get visitors like the cosmetology does?
They do not. The 3 that receive public visitors, I would say weekly, are culinary, cosmetology, and the fashion program. But the other programs may occasionally get a person that comes in, brings a donation or gets something, but not on a weekly basis.
Okay.
Oh, I didn't.
The nice thing, surprise. The nice thing about print production is that most of their design work is digital, so most of the approval work is done by email and that. So there's not the foot traffic that we get into culinary and cosmetology. So we might have the occasional guest, but it's not with nearly the frequency.
Mr. Kyler?
On that same note, now, on page 127, it says, print production. Program should be located near video production and textiles and fashion design. That's the only thing I see in here on location. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, what page were you referring?
Page 127.
So yes.
Design considerations.
So in the educational specification for print production, those ideally that it should be located near those two because they had the most collaboration between programs. It's actually, and I'm in the middle of design. We just had another design meeting. I should look at what the schematic, where it actually has. But we did try to keep those close in proximity together.
So under the current schematic design, print production and video production are next to each other, and they are above fashions in the two-story.
Which you're saying isn't an issue.
It is not an issue, no.
But believe me, if there was an issue from the staff or Mr. Eccles, it wouldn't be being presented. We have made, and the architect has made every attempt to make it work for them because they're going to be the end users and the ones that we want the building to work for. So.
Ms. Herbert?
I will say everybody is working really hard, and even when I went into Mr. Blizzard's class the other week, he already has his class already lined out and with all his little pieces put together like a whole diagram of how his whole classroom is going to be laid out. So they are on it. So I think a lot of people have put a lot of work into this.
Mr. Blizzard actually had his students work on laying out the shop.
It was very impressive.
As a practical exercise for the students to learn how to do that.
It's completed.
Mr. Kane, one of the questions I have is what the board had approved back in November was a $60 million project with an option for a $70 million project. And we haven't really seen things in terms of laying out what is the additional $10 million option. It's all been presented as this is the large project. And so I'm trying to understand when we approve, like I know when we had the discussion for the feasibility study, not the feasibility study, I'm sorry, the work session that we had last month, and we were discussing the design information. What came to the table was that, okay, well, we had in our CIP a $60 million project, $30 million local, $30 million from the state. And because of developing the full ed specs, the full project, which is potentially a $70 million project, it turned out that, well, that would have required $34 million to come from the local, and that request was put into the county, and no one on the Board of Ed knew about that $4 million increase, and it sounded like the commissioners didn't know about it either. That just kind of happened. And I'm concerned about the protocol of that and trying to understand, okay, are we talking about a $60 million project or a $70 million project, and at what point do we have the ability to say, yes, we're willing to spend that money, or no, we want to keep it to a $60 million project?
So the discussion back in the fall about the $26 million from the state and requiring 34 from the county was actually option C, which was the $60 million project. So option C, which was less renovation, less square footage, actually lowers the state participation, which, to keep a $60 million project, if the state doesn't give you the 30, but you want to keep a $60 million project, obviously that means the local share goes up. So that discussion was really based around C. Now, what was presented at the May work session was the full design or C plus as referred back in the fall. The reason we've been having the architect do the full design and working with the committee to do that is because it's necessary if at all we're going to do it. So we have to design it and lay it out. Now, as we go through the design process and bring the construction manager in and they give us a better idea of actually how much cost estimate there is and how it'll be phased and how basically they will help us define, okay, where is that C to C plus line? And the other thing I would say is we have to do the full design to submit this to the state. We can't send the state two different scopes of projects. They're only going to say, they're only going to review one, and they would say, which one do you want us to review? So at this point, we would want them to review the full scope, give us comments on that. As we get closer to construction documents and the bidding of the project, that's when we will start to define, okay, where is that line so that we can structure the bid in a way that when the board sees the bids, that they can make a decision with the available funding that they have to say, okay, we can do this or, do this. So that's kind of why it's been presented in that way so far.
Okay. And that makes sense to me, that we would do the specs of the full project, but at such point that we start bidding it out, we have the ability to say, we don't want to spend this much, and we can start paring back on some of the things that we might offer, or maybe we don't. But we have that we still have that option, even though we're submitting these specs for the full project.
And the more defined the design becomes, and bringing in the construction manager who has much more expertise in actually constructing the building and phasing it, we'll have a much better idea of where that line of C to C plus is and what things we need to pull out and bid as a kind of addition and can get separate prices, and then the board can say, okay, we have enough to do this, but not this, or we have enough to do it all, at that point. So.
Okay. Mr. Kyler.
On the schematic design, page 10, it shows option C first floor and C plus first floor. Is that the most significant difference between C and C plus, or is it also some interior renovations? And you guys would then, I know it needs a lot more design, but there would be alternates in the bid to add or delete depending on which way was the best way to do it. And this is showing some of the differences, particularly that the end with the big ramp and all that, whether or not that goes or not.
Yeah, so
Correct?
So this is the schematic design. So this is really, back in November, what the concept. The big difference at that point, because it's still conceptual, is the last phase of renovation is where C stops, which is carpentry, masonry, welding, and then the 1987 addition, heavy equipment and HVAC. And that was just a square footage, the estimate we got was a square footage estimate. When they hit 60 million, the square footage of these renovations was pulled out and added as C+. Obviously, as we go farther along in design, start selecting mechanical systems and finishes and things, we can work with the construction manager to start to hone in, okay, we could save money here, we could save it here. It's not just a raw square footage. And that's what we'll be working towards, as we go through the design process and be able to give the board much more detailed information. And the board approves the design development documents, which will have more information than this schematic design. And then ultimately they approve the construction documents, which is what is put out to bid, and we'll have those things identified, the alternates and additional work or breakdown.
But then also, the 1987 addition, which I can't remember which parts of the building, but that being renovated is one of the things that could drive additional money from the state that we could spend more and use less county money, correct? Or
there is the way the state formula works. The 1987 addition isn't fully eligible for funds because it's not quite 40 years old. So that whether we renovate it or don't renovate it, and different scenarios could play a factor. We're still working with the architects to look at that, so we don't have an answer whether it makes sense or not at this point. We're working towards that. At the point we did schematic design, though, that what's being presented was what was approved in November. It was to be renovated. So
Okay.
we're still working through, the development of this option, and whether it is or isn't, we're still working that out. But
So you're working on two things with the design. One, the total cost, but two, how to achieve more money from the state.
we're always working on that, yeah.
Yeah.
Mr. Kane, it does look like the information on pages 6 and 7 are outdated. It talks about the 20,000 square foot addition and the project estimates.
Wait a minute, I was looking at schematic design, we're still on that
Oh,
spec,
I'm sorry, we're still on the,
We've jumped.
That's okay.
I'm still on the ed specs.
So the ed spec was developed, and the ed spec committee finished last, I guess it was a year ago, April and May a year ago, and this document was the result of the planning committee developing it, and it hasn't been changed since the planning committee kind of signed off on it. So this document is what they completed last spring. I guess it could be amended, but the committee kind of all blessed this, so making changes, I'd probably want to go back to the committee just to make sure. But from the project budget is still the same. It's just the notation of phase 1, phase 2 obviously was what was discussed last year.
Okay, so there's no problem with submitting these this way with that
From the
information
state's
here?
perspective, no. They just like to see that there is an overall budget included so that they have an idea of if the scope and ed spec is it makes sense as far as scope wise.
Okay.
And the state certainly understands that it's an iterative process, and that the budget, as you refine, is the estimate, the cost estimate and budget is going to change through the process.
Okay. Then, board members, do we have any other questions on the ed specs as they've been submitted? It sounds like there's nothing that we would be changing tonight that wouldn't slow down the process anyway, and it's still consistent enough for state purposes.
Correct.
Okay. So then, with that, I will call for the vote on the ed specs. All those in favor? It passes unanimously. Thank you. Okay, and then we'll move on to, I need a motion for the approval of the schematic design for Carroll County Career and Technology Center addition renovation. Moved by Ms. Battaglia,
Second.
second by Mr. Kyler. Okay, now we can address additional questions that are in the schematic design. Were there any other comments that you have? Okay. Okay. Because I think we've already addressed the questions that I had in terms of the $60 million versus the $70 million project. So we'll have as this progress unfolds, and if the estimates come in higher, then we start adjusting
Correct.
what's in the ed specs and what's in the schematic design.
Correct.
Okay.
Well, we would actually adjust, I'm sorry, the ed spec and schematic design would be, we would be into design development documents. We make the adjustments at that point, which the board then approves, so.
Okay.
The state understands that the ed spec and the schematic are kind of the beginning of, and that it does evolve through the planning process, so as long as it's incorporated into the documents, the design development or the construction documents, that would be sufficient for the state.
Right. Okay. The one thing I would like to say is on the CIP change request that was made from the $30 million to the $34 million for local contribution, I'd like to request that moving forward. Like, I understand why we did that, but I don't like how we did it. I don't think that that's something that the Board of Ed should not have known about and that the Board of Commissioners didn't know about. I think that that's something like I said, I understand why we did it. It's a good business decision. It's the way the process was unfolding, but I think that we need to be more transparent.
Yeah.
We don't want to catch people off guard that, okay, all of a sudden we're at a $34 million request, not a $30 million request.
Well, now, if I characterized it that way at the May work session, I apologize, but it was not a request that we officially made to management budget. It was, we have discussions staff to staff throughout the winter. Certainly at the November work session, we talked about 26 million from the state and 30 from the county, and the fact that 60 million, that the math didn't add up, and that additional money. Their management budget staff and us had that conversation. If we want to keep it at 60, it would require more local funding, or we would need to, the county would need to lower the budget to 56 million at that point. So staff to staff, and then management budget, included it in their preliminary CIP and their recommended CIP, and it went through the county's budget process, but it wasn't like, we didn't have a meeting saying we officially request this. It was just part of conversations with staff to staff, which we have all the time on projects. So.
We all got caught, I think, off guard on that one, but it was done so that they could get or look for additional state funds to do this. And you realize that money is dedicated and sitting there. Mm-hmm. It comes off the other, so we have a little less dedicated money for the next project out of that, but the money is there, so if it adjusts a little bit, it wasn't as critical. Ted explained it to me. He had to make a decision to move that time, and the money's there. It wasn't like it wasn't available to us, so we did get caught on that, though, not knowing the exact amount, but hopefully that won't happen moving forward.
Right, and like I said, I understand why we did it. All I'm requesting is that we be more transparent about it going forward, because I go out to the capital improvement request all the time and look at that information, and so the fact that it says 30 million out there, but what's actually in the approved request says 30 million, but what's actually in the county budget is 34. Like, we just need to say it out loud, yes. And this board needs to be aware that those changes are being made, because it is our CIP request to the county. So
we all need that.
We need the transparency.
A suggestion on that for the future, and unfortunately I'm going to put Dr. Lockwood on the spot because this is only a conversation he and I have had one time so far, but when you submit your CIP request in October, that's it's somewhat similar to when you submit your requested operating budget to the county in February. And with the state, it's formula driven, so there's not a big question as to where the state money is going to fall out. It's just a matter of seeing what shows up in the General Assembly. With the commissioners, you wait out their budget process for the operating budget in the fall, and we have countless meetings here where Chris does slides over and over again. Historically, we just have never done much after your October CIP submission until the General Assembly happens, which drives the state portion, and until the county adopts its overall plan, including CIP. In the last couple years, we brought you the project totals for the projects that were approved. You actually voted on those a little bit ago, but that's the only thing that occurs from our end to you between October and May. So what we talked about was maybe when Chris is doing those operating budget updates that you're used to, when that sequences with a time where we know something more from the state because the IAC and the General Assemblies move forward, we'll make that part of a budget presentation as well. So we would be able to trace those things back and say things to you like, you had 10 projects in your October request, only 7 of them are being funded, and here's the most recent number we know from the state, and here's the number that the county is dealing with. So that way you'll see it, maybe not as often as you get an operating budget update, but probably at least, well, probably monthly from January through May. So that's just a thought to think on, but maybe that would be acceptable so that you don't feel caught off guard in the future when changes like that.
I think that's a good process improvement. I would appreciate seeing those true-ups, so to speak, over time, because if someone had asked me a month ago how much money is in for the local share for the career and tech, I would have said 30 million, and I would have been pretty sure that I was right, and I wasn't. So, Ms. Herbert?
Well, during that meeting, Mr. Weaver and I were sitting beside each other, and I said, "Hey, Mr. Weaver, thank you so much for the $34 million." And he looked at me like, "What?" And that's how it all came about, that the right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing. So,
Well,
but now we know.
that happened, it won't happen again, so let's
Right.
go on.
Okay.
I would like to, because there was a statement, just so the board knows, because some of you are new, when the board approves the CIP, the only budget year, the only dollar amount that is budgeted is the next fiscal year. So for the career and tech, the money that is being discussed was in an out year. It was in a plan. It wasn't actually funding allocated. So it was just like the 5-year operating plan. It was what they thought they would spend on the project in a future year. It wasn't actually a budget request to them for the money, and it wasn't actually a budget allocation. So in the CIP, it's only the first year, which is the budget. The other years can change and do quite often.
All right, board members, any other questions on the schematic design? I think we addressed most of them as in conjunction with the ed specs. No? All right, then I will call for the vote. All those in favor? Passes unanimously. Thank you. Okay. 7Q. So board members, I need a motion for the approval of additional legal fees for FY19.
So moved.
Moved by Ms. Battaglia.
Second.
Second by Mr. Kyler. Dr. Lockard.
Minute. Okay. Board members, the retainer fee for fiscal year 2019 with Pest and Cats Law has been paid, and invoices for all invoices have been reconciled. I'm recommending approval of $58,786.49 in additional legal fees beyond the retainer to the firm of Pest and Cats Law for the fiscal year 2019. Additional legal services over the retainer are discounted at 80% of the billable hourly rate.
Board members, any questions? And just to say that this is a request that comes every year, this time of year.
Correct.
We usually go over the retainer amount by some portion.
This is the smallest amount over retainer in many, many years. So
Okay, I thought it seemed small. I thought I remembered it being a lot bigger last year.
absolutely. We've had some really high years in the last 5-year time frame. Last year this is about half of last year's fee over retainer, but the best year we've had in many years.
Okay. All right. Board members, any questions? Okay, all those in favor? Passes unanimously. Thank you. Okay, I need a motion for the approval of, a motion for the approval to retain legal counsel FY20.
So moved.
Moved by Ms. Battaglia,
Second.
second by Mr. Kyler. Dr. Lockard.
Board members, I'm recommending approval of Pest and Cats Law as the Board of Education legal counsel for fiscal year 2020. Pest and Cats Law has reached agreement with Carroll County Public Schools, and that's outlined in the agenda with the contract retainer for the time period and the hourly billable rate, which $305 an hour, which reflects the Maryland Association of Boards of Education fee structure and no charge for legal services provided at all public board meetings. The recommendations in accordance with Board Policy DJA, professional technical service contracts, and as an exception under Policy DJE, bidding limits.
And Ms. Eisenberg, you get no charge for legal services provided at public board meetings, and you've been here pretty late.
That's correct, for many years.
All right, board members, any questions? No? All right, then I will call for the vote. All those in favor? Passes unanimously. Thank you.
May I say something?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Ed O'Mealy and I, on behalf of our law firm, Pest and Cats Law, are honored to be retained by you for the coming year. Thank you for your continued confidence in our legal services. On a personal note, August 1 marks my 42nd year serving as your counsel. I taught Marcia Herbert. And I could say things get more interesting every year. Ed and I and our colleagues find our work for you to be professionally rewarding, and we often say to one another how lucky we are to work with such an effective board and the Carroll County Public School staff. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Eisenberg. And I do want to say that the feeling is mutual. I really want to thank you, both you and Ed. Anytime that we have questions, you're very open and honest and very easy to talk to about those issues. So I want to thank you for the open lines of communication.
You're welcome.
Wish she was a student.
Pardon?
I wish she was a student. Don't.
A plus.
There you go, Mr. Weaver.
All right. So, board members, I need a motion for the approval of personnel transaction items.
So moved.
Moved by Dr. Dorsey,
Second.
second by Ms. Battaglia. Dr. Lockard.
Okay, board members, I want to inform you of 3 transfers. Earlier tonight, we talked about Principal Eric King from Manchester Valley assuming the Director of High Schools July 1st. We're recommending to transfer Joe Guerra, currently principal at Francis Scott Key High School, to principal of Manchester Valley High School. Mr. Guerra, formerly an assistant principal and acting principal at Manchester Valley, will bring experience and stability in terms of tenure at Manchester Valley. We're looking for several years of work from Mr. Guerra in this role, which he is well aware of and very excited about. I know that leaves a void at Francis Scott Key High School. We'll be advertising that position and looking to fill that vacancy as soon as possible. We're also recommending Shannon Zepp, currently assistant principal at Winters Mill High School, to assistant principal at Francis Scott Key High School effective July 1st, and Maria Martin, currently assistant principal at Liberty High School, to assistant principal at Winters Mill High School effective July 1st.
Board members, any discussion or comments?
I'm very excited.
All right, then I call for the vote. All those in favor? Passes unanimously. Okay, board members, I need a motion for the ratification of the 2020 Administrators and Supervisors of Carroll County Master Agreement.
So moved.
Moved by Ms. Battaglia,
Second.
second by Mr. Kyler. Dr. Lockard.
Ms. Baptist,
Yeah,
if you will.
thank you. Good evening, board members, Superintendent Lockard, and Commissioner Weaver. I am pleased tonight to present you with a ratification of new master agreements with 4 of our bargaining units. The board has been working through this process of negotiations with employee groups for many months, and is aware of all of the details. The bargaining process is always filled with ups and downs, challenges and successes, but we thank the board for your commitment and patience through the process. Also, tonight, there are members that are now, I was going to say in the audience, but now they're watching. And we want to thank and we thank them for sticking with the process, working together, and ensuring a successful conclusion. Lastly, we thank Commissioner Weaver and the Board of Commissioners. The final increase to the FY20 funding was extremely instrumental in helping us settle. Thank you. The 4 agreements for your ratification tonight are all effective July the 1st. Each agreement has already been ratified by the association. Therefore, they require your action to ratify to finish the process.
Board members, any questions or comments? And I would like to iterate the thank you to Commissioner Weaver and your board. That additional $1 million request really was instrumental for helping us reach agreement. So thank you very much for that.
The effect of both boards working together, to be able to, and I And Superintendent Lockhart, I do appreciate your help in doing that. And there was some some moments there. We're not sure how it's going to work, but it did work out. And I appreciate the collaboration that made this happen.
I agree wholeheartedly. Let's continue that.
Yes, at least for the next 3 or 4 years. Yeah.
Okay, board members, any questions on the master agreement for administrators and supervisors? Mr. Kyler?
What was the additional step added to the salary schedule?
So the administrators and supervisors bargaining unit took 3.5%. We just took 3.5% added to their current scale. So it just fostered all of the steps have a 3.5% increase in value.
Right. And so I think it's important to say that each one of the steps was increased by 3.5%, but employees are not getting a step.
Correct.
They're staying on the step that they're on and that step value has been increased by 3.5%.
So the value of the steps.
The values of the steps have changed.
The sentence in article says one additional step has been added to the salary schedule. That didn't make sense to me.
And Article 16?
16. The bold print.
Okay. Employees shall receive.
Mr. Kyler, is that on page 2
Yes,
of
it
the
is.
document that we're holding?
Yes, it
Okay.
is. So the representation is that the values of the steps themselves increased by 3.5%, not that the employees were going to
So
get.
there isn't an additional step?
No, it's not.
Yeah, okay.
So is that language that's been agreed to? Because that's actually a bit confusing.
Sure. We can still go back to the A&S bargaining unit and tell them that, have a dialogue with them in regards to there was a question, and just to say, for a point of clarification, we want to reiterate and clarify the language.
Okay, because I think we're all comfortable with the fact that there's a 3.5% overall increase. We're just want to make sure that we're very clear on the wording there. Does that?
I think what they did was they actually are technically giving a step, but that's what they did was they kept the starting step the same as what it currently is, and then they took for this upcoming year, they took the new step 2 will be equal to the old step 1 with a 3.5% increase on it. So they are getting their step, but everybody's step will equal exactly a 3.5% raise. That's why there's one additional step. So current step 1 becomes, with 3.5% becomes 2, 2 becomes 3, and then 10 becomes 11, which is the old 10 with a 3.5% raise on it.
Okay, okay. So we don't need to change this language then?
I believe that is the accurate, yeah, there is one additional step, because they technically are getting a step, but the step is equivalent to exactly a 3.5% raise.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, got it. Okay, board members, any other questions? Okay, then I call for the vote. All those in favor? It passes unanimously. Okay, and now we need a motion for the ratification of the 2020 Carroll County Education Association Master Agreement. Moved by Dr. Dorsey.
Second.
Second by Ms. Battaglia. Dr. Lockhart, any additional comments on this one?
No, other than I reiterate our thanks to commissioners for their support, our negotiating teams for the long duration and patience to get us to a place. I'm also very excited, certainly for the compensation component, but the starting teacher salary piece. You know, as part of the Kerwin funding, the 1.5% match, one of the goals of that was to take a look at starting teacher salary in the first couple of years of teacher salary. And we were able to move our starting teacher salary to $48,000, which is very competitive now, I believe, in terms of as we're recruiting and trying to bring people to Carroll County Public Schools. I believe that's significant. So kudos to both teams.
And I would like to echo that. That is a really good news story in terms of where we ended. So there's a lot of really good news stories, I think, that are coming out of this. So thank you for pointing those out. Board members, any questions? All right, then I call for the vote. All those in favor? It passes unanimously. Thank you. Now we need a motion for the ratification of the 2020-2021 Food Services Master Agreement.
So moved.
Moved by Ms. Battaglia,
Second.
second by Mr. Kyler. Dr. Lockard, any additional comments here?
Do not.
Okay. All right. And this was all in alignment with everything we had discussed. So board members, any comments or questions? No? All right, then I call for the vote. All those in favor? Passes unanimously. And one last one. We need an approval for the ratification of the 2020-2022 Local 2741, Council 67, American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFL-CIO, Master Agreement. That was a mouthful.
Yep.
So moved.
Moved by Ms. Battaglia,
Second.
second by Mr. Kyler. Dr. Lockard, any additional comments?
I do not.
Okay. And again, I believe this was all in complete alignment with our discussions. Board members, any questions? No? All right, then I call for the vote. All those in favor? Passes unanimously. Thank you. And we are done with the action items,
We're getting there.
which takes us to Section 8 on discussion. We have one item, the annual review of Policy AF, Student Data Privacy. Dr. Lockard.
Okay, board members, this is a discussion. No decisions need to be made tonight. We will be looking for feedback from you and the public. The student data privacy policy is being revised to update procedures and operational definitions. Mr. Anderson.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone, again. This evening, we're bringing an update to Policy AF, Student Data Privacy. When I arrived here at CCPS in November, I was handed an opportunity to look at how it is that we look at our digital approval or approval process for digital tools. We began having some conversation with a focus group, beginning to look at how it is that we put in a process that doesn't just look at one process for all different types of tools, but beginning to differentiate an approval process based on the actual tool, whether that be an app, whether that be a website, whether that be a device. And so that work led into this idea of updating some of the operational definitions of our current policy under student data privacy. You can see there that it's a far more extensive list of operational definitions in the policy that we're recommending, that we're going to recommend to be placed out for public comment over the next 30 days. But we've created a list that includes digital tool, essential digital tool, our PII information, school official, operator, and then supplemental digital tool as well. We feel like now that the industry's kind of caught up with the work, the outstanding work that our system had done in the past, we need to make sure that we are using more contemporary terms and having those terms listed so that we are speaking the same language, if you will. Once again, just to remind the board, our purpose is we want to begin to look at our expectations and as a school system in regards to holding teachers and staff members accountable for making sure that they are submitting whatever type of tool it is through the approval process. And there comes a time where there's a certain amount of responsibility and accountability that falls on the practitioner in the classroom. And so that's what we're looking to do. We've taken this policy, we've shared it with our cabinet. Dr. Lockard sent it out to cabinet to get feedback. We received a couple items of feedback which we're going to be taking into consideration. We've also vetted it through our legal a couple of times and met with them to get some feedback there as well. And so now what we're hoping to do is to put this out for public comment to get some insight and some feedback, and then we'll be able to hopefully return to you in 30 days' time for a potential vote.
Board members, any comments, questions? I just heard that sigh, Mr. Anderson.
No. That was something else I was thinking about.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good job. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great job.
Yeah.
Cleaned it up.
Well,
You
it
wanna-
was like I said, the actual policy was outstanding. It was actually held in high regard across the state for many reasons. And one of the things that we worked hard to do, and it was pretty broad the way it was applied. So when we started working on the workflow approval, we wanted to go ahead and begin to, as I said earlier, differentiate between the different tools.
I do want to say that Ms. Hammond from IT came and gave a presentation at the Teachers Advisory Council a couple of months ago. She did a fabulous job in the presentation, kind of schooling us on all the new terms and what it meant and how this was going to improve the whole process. And the teachers were literally running to give her a hug after that meeting. So, and I feel like this is a great first step in developing that technology strategy that we've been talking about, and I'm very excited to see it. I know a lot of work went into that, and just want to thank you for all your efforts here.
Yeah, it's been a work in progress, and again, we've gotten feedback from a couple staff members that we're going to be taking into consideration as well, and then also the recent House Bill 245, where it's recently determined that the state superintendent will identify a designee to chair a policy committee that will be looking across the state as well as other areas in the country about good quality policy in regards to student data privacy. So that's going to be extremely helpful for us and everyone across the state to have something that's synonymous and coming from the state.
Board members, any other comments or questions? No? All right.
Okay.
Mr. Anderson, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, and we will move on to Section 9, Unfinished Business, New Business. The first item is the Community Advisory Council feedback. We had decided to add this as an agenda item for each meeting, where we would say if there were any topics that came up during the meeting that we want to send to the CAC for comment. And I believe that the CAC is not meeting again, however, until September. Okay, so that will be their first meeting of the school year. Is that in early September or in late September? The dates aren't set. Okay.
Can I make a suggestion? Possibly the calendar for next year, because we have started getting emails regarding that, and it has come up in Baltimore County in the news. So possibly that's something that CAT can take back, and we can have that discussion, because we're going to have to vote on the calendar for the following year.
Dr. Locker, do you probably have some things?
Right, good suggestion. One of the things that I'd like to do as it relates to the calendar, typically, as has been practice, superintendent's tasked with bringing a recommended calendar to the board. I still want to do that, but what I'd like to do, I'm just informing the board, is put together a broader stakeholder group with some CAC member involvement, but also a wider swath of representation from staff, teachers, and community. I'll be working with Ms. Gaddis on this. I'd like to get out some survey information to our community, get some feedback about things in our calendar. Use all that plus this superintendent committee to come with recommendations by the time we're scheduled to do that in September, October-ish, September, I think, so that the board has a couple of months to wrestle with a couple of recommendations that have been vetted through the community, as well as informed by a broader survey feedback process. So I'm taking your suggestion, but just taking it a little broader.
Perfect.
Okay.
So once those recommendations are brought to the table, we could give that to the CAC for additional feedback from community.
Sure, you could. Like I said, I'm planning on including a couple of their members on that committee anyway. Yep.
Okay. Okay. So since the CAC isn't meeting then until September again, I do want to thank them for the feedback that they provided for the 3 policies that we had sent them last month. So the equity, the non-discrimination, and the threats of serious threats of violence. Appreciate their feedback, and I think over the course of the summer we can accumulate the topics that we potentially want to be addressing with them in the early months of the next school year. Does that make sense? Okay. I did, before we wrap it up, I did actually want to say, I know it's getting incredibly late, but I wanted to say, you know, thank Dr. Lockard. You are wrapping up your first school year as superintendent for the school system, and I just want to say what I think it was a fabulous year. I think you've made rounds out with the community. You've had your listening tour. I think people have been very receptive to everything that you've had to say and the fact that you are a good listener. You've not only been giving the community what your vision is, but you've also been listening to them as to what their thoughts and ideas are for making the school system better, and I think it's been an incredible year. I'm proud of the staff. I'm proud of our educators. I'm proud of our students. We just had a fabulous year, and what an exciting time to wrap it up with all the graduations. But I think that, you know, we've had challenges, but there are always challenges, and I think that you have risen to them with grace. And I just want to thank you for everything that you've done over the last year.
I very much appreciate that feedback. It's a pleasure to work with our board and our county leaders. Thank you for your support and ongoing input and direction. The credit, the staff I get to work with and the teachers in our schools are incredible. This is a great place. I've said all along, and one of the attractions for me was to come back home to a place that I love, but I also know is a great school system with tons of potential as well. So sure, we got our challenges, but I believe in our people, and I believe in the work that we do, and most of all, I believe in our students. And I know that we're just getting started. So I'm excited about what lies ahead. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, and with that, I will say that we have a meeting at 5 p.m. on Wednesday, July 10th, 2019, which is a board meeting with citizen participation in the boardroom here at 125 North Court Street, Westminster. And that is the only meeting on the agenda currently for the next month.
We have a few work sessions.
We have a few work sessions to schedule, so stay tuned. And with that, I will remind board members that we aren't done yet. We need to go back into closed after this. But I need a motion to adjourn open session. Moved by Ms. Herbert.
Second.
Second by Dr. Dorsey. All those in favor? Passes unanimously. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great evening.